welcome everyone to our evening on Margaret Mitchell and Gone with the Wind. So let's begin with a truly extraordinary heroine. Scarlett O'Hara, feisty, courageous, rebellious, difficult, and quite as colourful as her name. But she was not always so appropriately titled. During the 10 years upon which Margaret Mitchell worked on Gone with the Wind, the novel's heroine was as inappropriately named as it was possible for her to be. Instead of Scarlett, she was Pansy O'Hara. The creation of Gone with the Wind has many other fascinating stories. Written by a woman who only ever had one novel in her, the book broke all records in publishing and, when turned into a movie, in box office history. It was banned in communist countries because of Scarlett's intense attachment to the land, but the communists got hold of it and read it anyway. It tells of one of the most fascinating periods of American history. But most of all, Gone with the Wind is the story of a woman who, like her or loathe her, you are forced to give a damn about. Scarlett O'Hara of Tara must be one of the most memorable heroines of 20th century literature. So the creation of Gone with the Wind, the book and the movie, has many fascinating stories, and I'd like to share some of those with you this evening. It was written by a woman who only ever had one book in her. The book broke all records in publishing, and when it became a movie, it broke records in box office history. It used to be banned in communist countries because of Scarlett's very intense attachment to the land, but the communists got hold of it and read it anyway. The book tells of one of the most intriguing periods of American history. But most of all, it's the story of a woman who, like her or loathe her, in the end, you are forced to give a damn about her. Scarlett O'Hara of Tara is one of the most memorable heroines of 20th century literature. I'd like to begin with a reading from one of my very favourite scenes from Gone with the Wind. If you've seen the movie, you'll remember the wonderful ball scene. "Shh," said Scarlett. "Dr. Mead is going to make another announcement." The gathering quieted again as the doctor raised his voice, at first in thanks to the ladies who had so willingly given their jewellery. "And now, ladies and gentlemen, I am going to propose a surprise, an innovation that may shock some of you, but I ask you to remember that all this is done for the hospital and for the benefit of our boys lying there." Everyone edged forward in anticipation, trying to imagine what the sedate doctor could propose that would be shocking. "The dancing is about to begin, and the first number will, of course, be a reel followed by a waltz. The dancers following, the polkas, the schottisches, the mazurkas, will be preceded by short reels. I know the gentle rivalry to lead the reels very well, and so..." The doctor mopped his brow and cast a quizzical glance at the corner where his wife sat among the chaperones. "Gentlemen, if you wish to lead a reel with the lady of your choice, you must bargain for her. I will be auctioneer, and the proceeds will go to the hospital." Fans stopped in mid-swish, and a ripple of excited murmuring ran through the hall. The chaperone's corner was in tumult, and Mrs. Mead, anxious to support her husband in an action of which she heartily disapproved, was at a disadvantage. Mrs. Elsing, Mrs. Merryweather, and Mrs. Whiting were red with indignation. But suddenly the Home Guard gave a cheer, and it was taken up by other uniformed guests. The young girls clapped their hands and jumped excitedly. "Don't you think it's just a little like a slave auction?" whispered Melanie, staring uncertainly at the embattled doctor who heretofore had been perfect in her eyes. Scarlett said nothing, But her eyes glittered and her heart contracted with a little pain. If only she were not a widow, if only she was Scarlett O'Hara again, out there on the floor in an apple green dress with dark green velvet ribbons dangling from her bosom and tuberoses in her black hair. She'd lead that reel. Yes, indeed, there'd be a dozen men battling for her and paying over money to the doctor. Oh, to have to sit here, a wallflower against her will, and see Fanny or Maybelle lead the first reel as the belle of Atlanta. Above the tumult sounded the voice of the little Zouave, his Creole accent very obvious. "If I may, $20 for Miss Mabel Merriweather." Maybelle collapsed with blushes against Fanny's shoulder, and the two girls hid their faces in each other's necks and giggled as other voices began calling other names, other amounts of money. Dr. Mead had begun to smile again, ignoring completely the indignant whispers that came from the ladies' hospital committee in the corner. At first, Mrs. Merriweather had stated flatly and loudly that her Maybelle would never take part in such a proceeding. But as Maybelle's name was called most often and the amount went up to $75, her protests began to dwindle. Scarlett leaned her elbows on the counter and almost glared at the excited, laughing crowd surging about the platform, their hands full of Confederate paper money. Now they would all dance, except her and the old ladies. Now everyone would have a good time, except her. She saw Rhett Butler standing just below the doctor, and before she could change the expression of her face, he saw her, and one corner of his mouth went down and one eyebrow went up. She jerked her chin up and turned away from him, and suddenly she heard her own name called in an unmistakable Charleston voice that rang out above the hubbub of the other names. "Mrs. Charles Hamilton, $150 in gold." A sudden hush fell on the crowd, both at the mention of the sum and at the name. Scarlett was so startled that she could not even move. She remained sitting with her chin in her hands, her eyes wide with astonishment. Everybody turned to look at her. She saw the doctor lean down from the platform and whisper something to Rhett Butler, probably telling him that she was in mourning and it was impossible for her to appear on the floor. She saw Rhett's shoulders shrug lazily. "Another one of our bills, perhaps?" questioned the doctor. "No," said Rhett clearly, his eyes sweeping the crowd carelessly. "Mrs. Hamilton." "I tell you it's impossible," said the doctor testily. "Mrs. Hamilton will not—" Scarlett heard a voice, which at first she did not recognize as her own. "Yes, I will." She leapt to her feet, her heart hammering so wildly she feared she could not stand, hammering with the thrill of being the center of attention again, of being the most highly desired girl present, and oh, best of all, at the prospect of dancing again. "Oh, I don't care what they say," she whispered as a sweet madness swept over her. She tossed her head and sped out of the booth, tapping her heels like castanets, snapping open her black silk fan to its widest. For a fleeting instant, she saw Melanie's incredulous face, the look on the chaperons' faces, the petulant girls, the enthusiastic approval of the soldiers. Then she was on the floor, and Rhett Butler was advancing toward her through the aisle of the crowd, that nasty, mocking smile on his face. But she didn't care if he were Abe Lincoln himself. She was going to dance again. She was going to lead the reel. She swept him a low curtsy and a dazzling smile, and he bowed, one hand on his frilled bosom. Levi, horrified, was quick to cover the situation and bawled, "Choose your partners for the Virginia Reel." And the orchestra crashed into that best of all reel tunes, Dixie. So a really fabulous scene from Gone with the Wind. Scarlett desperate to dance again, Rhett Butler taunting her, and of course, in the end, knowing exactly what it is that Scarlett wants. So Margaret Mitchell, the woman behind this one truly groundbreaking novel. Well, she was born in Atlanta on the 8th of November in the year 1900. And here you can see a picture of her mother called May Bell, who was a Catholic, and her father, Eugene, was a lawyer. And here she is with her only brother, who was called Stevens Mitchell. Now, young Margaret Mitchell, or Peggy, as she was very frequently called, had a grandmother who had lived through the American Civil War. And one of her favourite activities when she was a little girl was to sit on her grandmother's veranda and hear stories about the various episodes and the battles and the impact of the Civil War on her family. Atlanta, at the time that young Peggy was growing up, was a flourishing city and a fairly new city with lots of new building. And of course, it was extremely aware of its Civil War history. Now, nobody actually thought to tell young Peggy Mitchell that the South had lost the war. So as a young girl growing up, she heard all of these wonderful stories of heroism and battles that were won. And it came as a terrible shock to her when finally she discovered that actually the South had lost the war. They hadn't been the victors. So that was something that I don't think she ever really quite got over, the shock of learning that the South had lost the war. She was 8 by the time she gained that useful piece of knowledge. There's her father, Eugene Mitchell. He was a lawyer. Their family was fairly comfortably off, so she led a fairly privileged childhood in Atlanta. Now, she was, as a child, a real daredevil. She loved horses. All her life, she was very accident-prone. She refused to conform properly. She preferred boys' games to girls' games. In fact, she once said as a young girl that she would rather have the hide beat off her than read the novels of Jane Austen. Not a good piece of criticism from young Margaret Mitchell. She was very tiny. She had red hair. So this picture, of course, is black and white, but you need to picture her with red hair. And she did not want to pose for that photograph. But when she was told that the kitten needed its photo taken, she was perfectly happy to hold the kitten so that it could be photographed, quite unaware of the fact that she was being photographed as well. Throughout her life, she was very accident prone. So accidents would bring about the writing of Gone with the Wind, and tragically, of course, would eventually end her life. So I think being something of a daredevil, taking risks, meant that she was always likely to be suffering from accidents. Now, she grew up as a real tomboy. She did not want to fit the mold of a nice little Southern girl. And so when she describes her heroine, Scarlett, as being something of a rule breaker, somebody who does not always want to behave like a nice Southern belle should behave, I think a lot of that was drawn from her own experience. She was sent off to a posh Atlanta school, but she was never happy there. In fact, she much preferred wearing trousers to wearing dresses. She was always popular with the boys. She would smoke. She was by this time starting to drink. So she really was something of a rule breaker as a young woman. During World War I, she helped with relief work for soldiers. There was also around this time a very bad fire in Atlanta, and she helped with the homeless at the time, people whose homes had been burned down, they needed to be found shelter. So I think that some of this charity work would also help her when it came to some of the scenes in her great novel where she describes people who have been burned out of their homes, people whose lives have been totally changed by the very cataclysmic events of the war. Now, she was popular with men, and she met a young soldier called Clifford Henry. He seems to have been the model for Ashley Wilkes. He was very gentlemanly, very polite, very handsome. He was quite poetic. He was rather dreamy, and he ended up being killed in World War I. So I think this image of this handsome, dreamy, and of course, through his death, very unavailable man would help to form the creation of her character, Ashley Wilkes. She was sent off to university, something that was not always typical for girls of that time, but she was not particularly happy there. She felt that all the girls were interested in was getting married, finding, suitable husbands. That was not something that really worried her. And after only about a year at Smith University, she dropped out when her mother died very suddenly. In 1918, her mother died from the Spanish flu epidemic, and Margaret felt that she needed to go home and keep house for her father and look after him. So she doesn't seem to have ever regretted that decision to leave university. However, leaving university did not stop her from being a debutante. And of course, it was expected that she would go to the right number of parties and she would meet the appropriate young men and she would end up getting married. However, she ended up deeply shocking the matrons of Atlanta, a very conservative group of people, it has to be said. She ended up dancing something called an Apache dance or an Apache dance. This was something that had come from Paris. It was considered deeply shocking. So by dancing this particular dance, Margaret really put herself on the outer when it came to proper Atlanta society. She then ended up meeting a man called Rhett Butler, and he would later claim that he was the model for Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. Certainly there are similarities with the names. Red and Rhett are definitely rather similar. He was handsome, red-haired, tall, unconventional, and she was totally smitten by him. Now, he had a rather mysterious background, just like Rhett Butler in the novel. There were whisperings of scandal in his background. It made him all very mysterious and, of course, even more attractive. She, at this time, rejected the Catholic Church, and she decided to accept Rhett Butler's proposal and agreed to marry him. She was at this time expelled from the Junior League Debutantes Club for doing that very shocking dance and dressing in outrageous clothes. Peggy would later get her revenge on the Debutantes Club. Once she became a famous author, they, of course, wanted to know her again. She took great delight in always turning down their invitations. Now, Rhett Butler had a very good friend, a man called John Marsh, and he too was in love with Peggy, but he realized that he could not really compete with his handsome friend, Red. He was the complete opposite to Red. He was steady, he was shy, he was quiet. Red liked fast cars, lots of drink. He was almost certainly involved in bootlegger liquor sales. He was an incredibly dashing fellow. So Peggy agreed to get married. And there you can see bride and groom at the wedding. Evidently, Peggy's grandmother sobbed very loudly through the entire wedding. It must have made it a very cheerful occasion indeed. They went off on their honeymoon, and I think almost immediately Peggy realized she had made a very big mistake. The honeymoon was not a success. We don't know what went on. The marriage would last only a few months. He would later return, and it's been said that he raped her when he came back. He would try to get money from her, and she would try her very hardest later in her life to keep his very existence away from the press. But of course, he read her novel, and when it came out, he rang her up and he said to her, well, I figure you still love me because quite clearly I'm Rhett Butler in your novel. He would later die as a down and out, so Rhett Butler's career was never a particularly promising one. Gorgeous photos of Margaret Mitchell with cats. She always loved cats throughout her life. Now, for comfort at this very difficult time of her life, when she was separated from the man she was married to, she was in a very in-between sort of position, she turned to his best friend, John March, a man who was totally supportive of her. And she also began her own career as a journalist, and she proved to be an extremely good journalist. As you can see, she was tiny, not even 5 foot. Here she is in a world of male reporters working as a journalist, something that was not easy. Women at that time were expected to maybe do the sewing or the cooking pages of a paper, but certainly not really important journalism. But Margaret, in many ways, broke new ground as a journalist. She particularly liked doing anything that connected with Atlanta's history, particularly during the Civil War. And this, of course, would give her very useful knowledge and experience when it came to the writing of her book. So she was very busy working as a journalist for some years. John would help her with the style of her writing, and also with her grammar, which was never particularly good. So in 1924, she was able to get a divorce from her husband, Rhett. And very soon after that, and there you can see a book that's been produced about her as a reporter, she realized that she had actually become very, very fond of her husband's friend, John. It was around this time that John began to suffer from a terrible attack of the hiccups. They just didn't stop. And that can be incredibly exhausting for the human body to be hiccuping every minute or so for day after day after day. In fact, John's hiccup attack lasted for 42 days, and they thought he was actually going to die as a result of this. So Peggy, at this time of crisis for his health, realized that she had actually fallen in love with this man, and they became engaged, and they got married 1 year after her divorce from Rhett in the year 1925. Now, the two of them ended up renting an apartment, and you can still visit the Margaret Mitchell apartment in Atlanta today. It is a really fabulous museum. Neither of them ever wanted children, and you might remember from reading Gone with the Wind that Scarlett is a truly dreadful mother. She should not be having any babies at all. And he was a wonderfully supportive husband. So it was a very happy, very close, companionate marriage that the two of them eventually found themselves in. Now, some months after she had got married to him, Peggy was involved in a car accident, and for some months she was housebound in the apartment, which is just on the ground floor of this building that you can see. It's the bit off to the left there on your screens, and a really wonderful museum today. So she was stuck in the apartment and couldn't really get out of bed or do very much. And she kept sending her husband off to the library to get various books for her. And eventually he'd come back and he'd say, well, Peggy, you've read all the books in the library. I can't find anything new for you. Maybe you need to write something yourself. And so he knew that she had always been hugely interested in the American Civil War, and particularly in the role that Atlanta played in the Civil War. And he said, why don't you write something that's set in the Civil War? So in that room downstairs that you can see in the picture, Peggy Mitchell began to write her novel. Now, the book really has a pretty extraordinary sort of composition history. The very last thing to be written in the book was the opening chapter. As I mentioned earlier, the heroine was, throughout the writing of this book, named Pansy O'Hara. She was only changed to Scarlett O'Hara right at the very end. Tara was originally called Fontenoy Hall. And she wanted to write this book to show the story of the Civil War, not from the position of the men who went off to fight at the front, but the women who had to stay home, have babies, try and keep everybody together, feed their families. That was her aim in writing this book, was to show the story of the Civil War from the women of the South who remained at home, the women who refused ever to admit defeat. She was incredibly careful writing this book with dates and details. and she would keep her book a secret from most people. It took her 10 years to write. She'd do a bit from the beginning, then she'd do a bit much later on. And as she completed each chapter, she would stuff it into a brown envelope, and she'd put these envelopes in all sorts of different places around her flat. So some might end up in the top of the wardrobe, some might go under the bed, some would be stuck into a chest of drawers somewhere. There were bits of Gone with the Wind all over the apartment. She stopped her journalism. She had confidence that maybe one day her book would be published. But the book just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And sometimes she would write several versions of one scene without ever really discarding the others and working out which version was the best. Her husband kept pushing her to finish it. Every detail counted. She'd even try and find out if it had rained on a particular day when she's setting a scene and needed to know about the weather. I don't know that she would ever have got around to gathering all these bits together and sending them off to a publisher. But eventually, a representative from Macmillan's publishing firm came on a scouting tour down in the southern states of America. And he was told by somebody that this woman called Peggy Mitchell was working on a book. So he went to see her. Now, there were bits of this book all over the apartment. And at first, she refused to give it to him. But finally, I think she realized she'd made a mistake by saying no. And she ended up rushing to meet this man just as he was getting on the train to head back up north. And she handed him all of these different envelopes, no proper order, everything mixed up, no beginning, no ending to the book, and the heroine still named Pansy. The man got onto the train and he started to read. And by the time he arrived back in New York, he knew that he had a bestseller on his hands. He had a manuscript that would one day make publishing history. To begin with, Peggy could not really believe that her book was going to be published. Now, in many ways, Gone with the Wind is not a great classic novel. Her style is not particularly literary or polished. She could have learned quite a bit from Jane Austen. But what Peggy did that was so wonderful was to tell a story. And there's no doubt she's a superb storyteller. She juggles hundreds of incidents and hundreds of characters, and the action and the passion of the novel never flag. Now, of course, once the book had been accepted for publication, she had to work really hard to sort everything out into the right order and tidy up the manuscript. The name of Pansy was only changed to Scarlett at the very last minute. Her husband, John, helped her with the various grammatical mistakes. She was always very suspicious of outside help, and even though he was trying to hold down a career as a lawyer, he spent an enormous amount of time trying to help her with her manuscript. She also had no title for her novel. The title was giving her real problems. She thought of various options. Tomorrow is another day. There's always tomorrow. But the phrase "gone with the wind" is actually there in the book. And finally, that was the phrase that was chosen as the title for the novel. She found editing the book completely exhausting, and she suffered from very frequent health problems. And from this time, I think, became a real hypochondriac, using her health as an excuse for never writing another book, or for not doing anything that she didn't particularly want to do. Now, the book, when it came out, was to sell for $3 a copy. That doesn't sound a lot to us today, but remember, this was Depression time in America. $3 was a lot of money for somebody. So you had to really want a copy of Gone with the Wind to go out and buy it. Publicity began very quickly indeed, and this is what the first edition of the novel looked like. There was a lot of publicity before the book even came out, and film companies from the very beginning were interested in the idea of making a movie of Gone with the Wind. It was chosen as a book of the month. This was a guaranteed selling point. If your book was chosen as book of the month, you knew that certain thousands of copies would automatically be sold. So it was a great thing to have your book chosen as book of the month. And early orders all showed that this novel would be a huge success. Margaret Mitchell was paid $500 for her novel, plus a percentage of the sales. It did not make her a phenomenally wealthy woman, but of course it made her famous. Very rapidly, the book started to become something of a literary event. Bookstores were sold out even before the copies arrived. No other first novel had ever sold like Gone with the Wind. So it was mentioned in the papers, publicity was absolutely huge. Reviewers of the very early copies were hugely full of praise. In fact, some reviewers compared the book to Tolstoy's War and Peace, or to a novel by Dickens or Thomas Hardy. She began to be mobbed by her fans. The phone never stopped ringing, and she never got herself an unlisted number. And she found that she was an overnight celebrity. So by the end of 3 weeks, the book had already sold 178,000 copies. And there you can see a bust of Margaret Mitchell, and of course she has appeared on an American postage stamp. Margaret really struggled to cope with the fame that came from her book. She spent very little of the money that she used, and she overworked herself replying to fan mail. She couldn't cope with the image of her that had been created by the press. She felt that she was not a Scarlett O'Hara, that she just didn't live up to this image that the press was expecting her to resemble. Nor did she ever really understand her book's success. I think a large part of the success was the timing of this novel. It came out at exactly the right time. The effects of the Depression in America were very similar to the effects in the South of the American Civil War. When Scarlett says, "As God is my witness, I'm going to live through this, and when it's over, I'm never going to be hungry again." And that appealed to contemporary readers who were hungry in the time of the Depression. America's self-image at the time was very low. The dollar had lost value, companies were going bankrupt, politics had divided the nation. The nation in many ways needed a sort of re-emergence of its former glory. And the book celebrated the American past. So I think all of those reasons contributed to the success of Gone with the Wind coming out at the exact time in which it was published. The ending, I think, also really added to the book's success. Now, the ending is famously left open. Readers need to decide for themselves whether Scarlett ever gets Rhett Butler back. When she says at the end of the novel, "Tomorrow is another day," one is left wondering if tomorrow is going to include Rhett Butler or not. So I think the open ending of this novel also added hugely to its success. People were given a hope that maybe Scarlett's life could come right and that she would find romantic happiness in the end. It's all left up to us as to what we think. Margaret Mitchell was asked very frequently, does Scarlett ever get Rhett Butler back? Well, I'm one of those readers who like to believe that she does. And of course, hundreds of readers sent her letters saying, "Please, can you tell us?" Well, once she said that she was pretty certain that Scarlett did get Rhett back, but most of the time she would simply refuse to answer the question. So the fame of the book spread incredibly rapidly. As I mentioned earlier, it was banned by the communists. They disapproved of Scarlett's great longing and love for the land, her deep attachment to the land of Tara. And by this time, it was becoming almost a daily thing in the news, talking about a possible film version of Gone with the Wind. Who would play those 4 important main parts? It was at this time that she received a phone call from her ex-husband, Rhett. She was terrified that he would sue her for libel. She was really frightened of this man coming back into her life. And in many ways, she just disliked the fame of her novel. She went into hiding from fans and the press. She seems to have been upset and astonished by her fame, and she did not like it. Her father read her book, but said he could never wade through it again. It was way too long. She decided then and there that she would never write another novel. There is a story that she wrote called Lost Laceham. It was a story that she wrote when she was much younger, but she never again attempted another novel. So I think she made up her mind she was a one-book author. She always formed plenty of excuses as to why she was not writing another book. She never looked like a celebrity. She disliked book signings. In fact, very rapidly, she refused to sign any more copies of Gone with the Wind. She wore old clothes. She drove her old car. She continued to live in her cramped apartment, although she would eventually move to a slightly better one. But the apartment that I showed you earlier was nicknamed The Dump, and it certainly was not the sort of grand apartment that you expect a best-selling writer to be living in. So she did not look like a celebrity. She did not want to behave like a celebrity. But of course, the fame of the book went on and on. David O. Selznick paid $50,000 for the film rights for Gone with the Wind. This was the highest price ever paid for film rights for a first novel. And the search for the right Scarlett O'Hara began. By this time, Gone with the Wind was creating its own industry. You could buy Scarlett O'Hara dolls, Rhett Butler cufflinks and watches. The merchandising was all appearing connected with the novel. 1 year after publication, the book was still the top-selling book in the United States. Evidently, Franklin D. Roosevelt said of it, "No book need be that long," but people still went out, they paid their $3, they read, and they loved Gone with the Wind. Then the novel won the Pulitzer Prize, and this shows Peggy at the ceremony for the Pulitzer Prize award. Money was now pouring in as a result of her book. But she continued, I think, to be a rather difficult and in many ways a very independent woman. She did not want to have much to do with the press or with her publishers, even with friends. She was very reserved about getting together because she was terrified that things might be reported to the press. Any copy that she had signed now sold for a large amount of money on the black market. She continued to live her fairly simple lifestyle. She loved bawdy jokes. She loved corn liquor, so a very hard alcohol indeed. She loved what she called brawly parties. So she and John would go off to these parties, and she really tried to lead her life in a way that she had been living it before Gone with the Wind changed things forever. Now, finally, the book went off the bestseller lists 21 months after publication. It would go back onto those lists later when the movie came out. Now, the movie was fraught with problems almost from the beginning, and filming of the story started even before an actress had been found to take on the role of Scarlett O'Hara. Margaret Mitchell was thrilled with Vivien Leigh, and the making of the movie was big news. Every detail got reported. It would end up having its premiere in the city of Atlanta in December 1939. So, of course, that was enormous news, and thousands of people turned up, and it was the society event in the history of Atlanta. Margaret Mitchell met Clark Gable, that wonderful Rhett Butler. Evidently, they didn't really know quite what to say to each other. Hattie McDaniel did not come to the premiere of Gone with the Wind. She's the marvellous actress who plays Mammy in the film. Of course, as a black woman at that time in the Deep South, she would have been forced to sit in a separate part of the cinema. And so she refused to turn up for the premiere, and she was tried to make people aware of just how badly treated black people still were in the state of Georgia. So first there was the legend of the book, and then there was the legend of the movie. Margaret Mitchell said that Clark Gable was really only adequate as in the role of Rhett Butler. She thought Olivia de Havilland was pretty good. She did not like the actress playing Miss Pittypat, who I think does a wonderful job, but she felt that Scarlett was absolutely perfect. And when the movie premiered, all of Atlanta was wanting to pay homage to Margaret Mitchell. World War II broke out. Her father died during that time, and Peggy was very involved with writing letters to soldiers during the war. She launched a Navy boat called the USS Atlanta, and she raised a huge amount of money for the war effort. Peggy had once announced that she was quite certain she would die in a car crash, and she was very prescient. At the end of the war, there was a new surge of interest in Gone with the Wind. I guess, again, the feeling of recovering from a war, coming through. The message of the book was, once again, very relevant. Margaret Mitchell had to fight a battle over copyright with a Dutch publisher over a pirated edition of the novel, and her husband, John, suffered a stroke. Then, in 1949, she was trying to go over the road to a cinema with her husband, and she had to make a decision. It looked like the road was clear. She decided to dash across. Her husband decided to wait on the traffic island, and she was hit by a driver. She was knocked unconscious. She was rushed off to hospital, and she ended up dying in hospital just a few days later, 5 days after the accident. So she was prescient when she felt that one day she would die in a car crash. And it's possible to visit her grave. There she is buried next to her husband, John Marsh, and there she is, Margaret Mitchell Marsh, in a cemetery in Atlanta. So many people wanted to come to the funeral that funeral tickets had to be issued. And there you can see her husband, John, at the funeral. Her book, I think, had become a part of Western culture, and it is a wonderfully readable novel. I was a young teenager of 14 when I first came across Gone with the Wind. My mother handed me this huge, fat book with no pictures whatsoever. There wasn't even a picture on the cover. And she said, "Darling, I think you might be ready for Gone with the Wind." I took it away, and I was a bit dubious about this book. The title sounded quite good, but there were no pictures and there was no blurb on the back to tell me what it was all about. And I opened that front and I turned to the first page. Scarlett O'Hara was not beautiful, I read. Oh, did I really want to read a book about a heroine who was not beautiful? But I continued, and I think by about page 2, I was completely and utterly hooked on Gone with the Wind. I barely left my bedroom for 3 days, and my dear mother kindly allowed me to read the book as I was eating my meals. So within 3 days, I had finished Gone with the Wind. I think I felt as exhausted as poor Melanie after giving birth. I was probably a bit pale and a bit deprived of sleep, but it is a very memorable experience, that very first reading of Gone with the Wind. And I will forever be grateful to my mother for handing it to me at exactly the right time. So the book, of course, became the huge issue of the movie. And the movie added to the sales of the novel, added to its status as a real classic in American literature. And it became a real high moment in the history of Hollywood, famous for its excess, its drama, the history, the film techniques that needed to be used, and the enormous hassle that it was to turn this enormous book into a film. I think it came out at a time when the world needed comfort. There had been the Depression, and there was certainly a sense that another war was coming. David O. Selznick had done A Tale of Two Cities. He had worked on Anna Karenina, David Copperfield, The Prisoner of Zenda, and A Star is Born. He actually added the O to his name just as a little affectation. It was not part of his original name. He was the head of production of this movie at the age of only 30. It's a book about survival, and I think there must have been times when he wondered if he would survive the filming of this movie. As I mentioned, he paid $50,000 for the book, and the deal was closed 1 week before the book was published. But he knew that he had problems. For a start, there was the length of the book. This was going to make one mighty long movie. He immediately made George Cukor the director. They were good friends. And Sidney Howard wrote the script. He was considered one of the best scriptwriters of the day. Margaret Mitchell wanted no connection with the workings of the movie. Now, various actresses were discussed when it came to the casting of Scarlett O'Hara. Katharine Hepburn, Barbara Stanwyck, Miriam Hopkins, Betty Davis, Maureen O'Sullivan were some of the actors who were suggested for the part. Altogether, 121 actresses were recommended for the role, and including one truly astonishing suggestion, Lucille Ball was one of those whose name was put forward as a possible Scarlett O'Hara. But one man sent in a letter from New Zealand, and he said, I think you should consider a young actor called Vivien Leigh. And of course, she would end up becoming Scarlett O'Hara. So the whole role of who was going to take on Scarlett became something of a mania, a real newsworthy item all around the world. 32 actresses did screen tests for the role. Now, Rhett Butler was a little bit easier to cast. They were thinking of Gary Cooper and Errol Flynn, but the public all insisted it needed to be Clark Gable. And David O. Selznick needed to pay plenty in order to get Clark Gable because he was under contract to another studio. The very first script draft was for a 5.5-hour movie, definitely too long. William Cameron Menzies was hired as the production designer, and he did a sort of sketching out of what was going to be included in each scene. But the script went through many, many changes, and really it was a movie that caused a huge amount of stress to almost everybody involved in it. The very first time that David O. Selznick ever went to the Deep South was for the premiere of the movie. But an historian was hired to help with the sets and to make sure that the period details were correct. MGM finally agreed to loan Clark Gable, and they would take some of the shares of the profit. Gable did not want to do this picture, but the shooting had to start. Other script writers were brought in. He was not keen on the idea of doing a southern accent. He said, you've got to put up with the accent that I've got. Evidently, he had very bad breath, so Vivien Leigh was not all that excited by the very close-up scenes that she had to do with Clark Gable, and he was a dreadful dancer. So in those ball scenes that I read you earlier, when he dances with Scarlett, evidently they had to create a special moving platform under his feet that would make him look as if he was gliding along, dancing very nicely indeed. Now, at this time, Paulette Goddard was emerging as the most likely Scarlett O'Hara. She was a friend of David O. Selznick's, and she was something of a Scarlett in real life. But gradually, of course, this name of Vivien Leigh became more and more important, and she would finally end up getting the role. Vivien Leigh had been born in India in a very well-off family. She'd been in a movie called Fire Over England, which had been a success. But she had an English accent, not a southern one, and she had fallen for Laurence Olivier. She'd left her husband and her children, and she went off to America with Olivier, and she was signed up with an agent, Myram Selznick. So it was a bit of a problem that she was living with this man who was not her husband, and they were pretty much forced to be apart during the filming of Gone with the Wind. Then there were problems with filming some of the very dramatic war scenes of the movie. Old sets at Hollywood were needing to be destroyed in order to make space for new sets. So it was decided that they would burn these sets as the burning of Atlanta. They used 7 Technicolor cameras, all 7 that were then currently in existence, so there could be no retakes of the scene. If they did not get it right, tough luck, they had ruined their chances. Stunt doubles would take on the parts of Rhett and Scarlett, and Vivien Leigh would go to watch the burning of Atlanta. And she was introduced on that occasion, so this was very early in the filming, to David O. Selznick. And Myron O. Selznick said to his son, "Meet your Scarlett O'Hara." And so it was around the time of the filming of the burning of Atlanta that finally the director of the movie got to meet the woman who would play the major role. Now, Leslie Howard was considered to be too old for Ashley Wilkes. He was actually 46 at the time he took on this role. He needed quite a lot of hair dye and various bits of makeup in order to make him look younger. He too was very reluctant to take on this role, and he had to be promised to be allowed to produce Intermezzo with Ingrid Bergman. He had never read the book. He never read the words of any other character in the movie apart from his own. But he is wonderfully convincing as Ashley Wilkes. Olivia de Havilland was the very first choice for Melanie, but she too was under contract to another studio, so getting her also proved to be difficult. And of course, the filming of very grand scenes, such as this one showing all of the wounded in the main square of Atlanta, proved to be extremely expensive and difficult to film. They didn't have enough real actors to take on wounded soldiers, so they ended up using dummies for quite a few of the bodies that are lying there in the square. By this time, David O. Selznick was on drugs just to keep him going through the filming of this movie. He was already preparing a movie of Rebecca based on Daphne du Maurier's book. He was publicising Gone with the Wind well before the movie was finished, and he was finishing the filming of Intermezzo. He was also rewriting the script. The studio was in a state of chaos, morale was low, everybody was completely exhausted by the movie. But finally, the filming of Gone with the Wind was finished. Retakes still needed doing. Continuity was a nightmare because there'd never really been one fully final script of the novel. And Selznick spent hours in the cutting room. The production crew fell asleep frequently in their chairs in the cutting room from total exhaustion. New special effects techniques were invented. The background to Tara was painted on glass, and that was a way of capturing the background for the very first time. Then World War II broke out, but this seems to have barely disturbed the making of Gone with the Wind. Sidney Howard, who had been working on it, died in an accident. The preview was a secret from the press, but at this time they still had no music or titles to go with the film. So there were all these difficulties, and it was a very mad rush to finally get Gone with the Wind prepared for the movie. Again, the scenes had not been filmed in order. Cukor and Selznick disagreed. All sorts of script changes came and went, and it was a troubled movie right to the very end. Victor Fleming was a friend of Clark Gable's, and he was chosen eventually to come in and see what he could do to finally get this movie into shape. For 17 days, filming was shut down, and this ended up costing $10,000 a day. The script was rewritten again, based again on the original Howard script, but with changes. Filming resumed, and Victor Fleming proved to be a very macho director who sort of revitalized the film and was the man who was needed at this time. He was very harsh, evidently, with Vivien Leigh. Selznick was writing endless memos. The picture was way over budget. Now, Vivien Leigh is in almost every scene. Olivia was in New York and she just wanted the film over and done with so that she could get back to Laurence Olivier. She was angry about this separation from her beloved Larry, and I think that some of this anger went into the film. Victor Fleming became exhausted and near collapse. He walked off the set and just disappeared for 2 weeks because he could not cope with any more of it. But all sorts of costume design had to be done. That too was incredibly expensive. Hattie McDaniel, I think, was one of the great stars of the movie as Mammy. Black actors were disapproved of for accepting their roles. And of course, the Ku Klux Klan was very far from dead in the Deep South. And they had to try to remove some of the derogatory comments that were there in the film. And of course, today, both the book and the movie are looked at from a more modern, more PC point of view, and many people disapprove. But what Margaret Mitchell is showing is the way that life was in the South at the time of the Civil War. Even Scott Fitzgerald, the great author of The Great Gatsby, worked very briefly on the script of Gone with the Wind, but he was fired, and it's thought whatever he wrote just ended up on the cutting room floor. So it was a very troubled filming to this movie. The initial scene of Scarlett O'Hara on the veranda at Tara with the Tarleton twins was reshot 5 times before they were happy that they had got it right. Selznick was a real perfectionist, and even the lace on Scarlett's dress had to be proper lace all the way from France, not just any old lace that she was wearing. So when finally the film was watched by people, the audience reaction was wonderful. It had cost $3 million, and everybody predicted that the movie would make a loss. Selznick, right up until the very end, was adding to the film, doing retakes only 1 month before the preview. The music needed to be a real star of the picture, and there was a last-minute frenzy to get 3 hours of music that would be suitable. But the movie premiered in Atlanta on the 15th of December, 1939. And there you can see Peggy Mitchell with some of the stars of the movie. The whole of Atlanta was excited by the premiere. Atlanta at the time was a pretty poor provincial town, and it gained huge pride from the premiere of this movie. Atlanta felt incredibly possessive about this picture. At the intermission, those were the days of intermissions, there was a hush. And of course, everyone was thinking, what do all the others think of this movie? Is it going to be a success, or will it be a failure? And Margaret Mitchell spoke in public for the first time about the movie and admitted that she had cried watching her own story up there on the film. The movie won many Academy Awards, all for technical aspects. In fact, the night was called a benefit night for David O. Selznick. The screenplay won an award, so did Victor Fleming. Hattie McDaniel won Best Supporting Actress. Vivien Leigh won for Main Actress, and David O. Selznick got 2 Oscars. And of course, the merchandising, the translations, all the different things connected with this book had really started another new life. So there have since been sequels such as Scarlett or Rhett Butler's People, and the merchandise is all out there to this day. The movie has earned a truly astonishing amount of money ever since. For a very long time, it had the largest audience of any film ever made. Eventually, those different actors ended up going back to Atlanta in 1961 for the centenary of the Civil War. And many of them, of course, or in fact, most of the actors involved in the movie have now gone. Leslie Howard died in 1943 in a plane crash. He was on a secret mission for the British government. In 1960, gorgeous Clark Gable suffered a heart attack. In 1965, David O. Selznick died. Vivien Leigh died in 1967. And the wonderful and beautiful to the very end, Olivia de Havilland, lasted until 2020. She was over 100 years old when she died. So that is only a very, very small part of the excitement of Gone with the Wind. I will never forget going to see the movie for the very first time. I knew that it was coming to a cinema in Auckland after a disaster movie had finished its screening. It was a movie called The Towering Inferno. Every day I would check the papers to see if The Towering Inferno was in its last week. Finally, they advertised, yes, only 5 more days. Then it got extended, much to my regret and grief. And I eventually started thinking I was never going to see this movie called Gone with the Wind after so loving the book. But finally, The Towering Inferno burned down forever and there were no more screenings. And Gone with the Wind opened, and there in the audience on that very first night of the screening in New Zealand, I sat with my family to watch Gone with the Wind. And when the words Gone with the Wind flashed across the screen, I burst into tears before the movie had even begun. This is a book and a movie that have meant a huge amount to me. And I think due to the popularity of this talk this evening, it's a book and a film that has meant a huge amount to many other people as well. So let's end with Scarlett's very hopeful words at the end of the book. After all, tomorrow is another day. And if anyone has any questions they would like to ask, please go ahead.
It was a wonderful film. We saw it here in Melbourne at the Regent Theatre with intermission.
So when the book came out, Dorothea, did you read it in English, I assume?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Not in German. I mean, it was translated into lots of languages very, very rapidly. Yeah. So many people must have read it, of course, in translated versions. But
I just know about it.
Yeah.
I don't know for how long.
Yeah.
Yeah, part of my life.
Yes, well, I think for so many of us it is. And it's very interesting that it's not a movie that anybody has ever tried to do again. You know, they keep coming up with remakes of this, that, or the other. But I think they realize that with Gone with the Wind, it is so embedded in public consciousness with those actors are those characters. And to make a different version is just courting criticism, really. So I don't know if they're ever going to try and make another version of Gone with the Wind. But
I wouldn't see it. How can you play Rhett Butler with somebody else but Clark?
I know. He's so gorgeous.
Despite his bad breath.
I know. That moment when she's in the room with Ashley and she's telling Ashley how much she loves him, and then he leaves and she throws that vase and he rises from the sofa. It's our first view of him in the movie, and it's just one of the great movie moments of all time. And another interesting problem that they had with the movie was the use of language in the film. Of course, when he leaves at the end of the book and he famously walks into the mist, he says, "Frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn." Now, the word damn was not allowed to be used, and they actually had to get special permission. They had to argue it was such an integral part of the book that they really needed to use the word damn. So they were able to keep that word. But there's another scene in the movie. Rhett has had his way with Scarlett, and then he's gone away. And when he comes back, she has to tell him that she's expecting a baby. And she's standing at the top of the stairs, and she tells him she's furious. She doesn't want another baby. She tells him that she's pregnant. And in the book, he says to her, "Cheer up, my dear, perhaps you'll have a miscarriage." Well, it was considered in the 1930s that using the word miscarriage in a movie was definitely not on. So in the movie, he says, "Cheer up, my dear, perhaps you'll have an accident." So accident is regarded as more proper, perhaps less gynecologically focused. So they had all sorts of problems with the language in the movie and, what words they could use from the book. So it was not an easy movie to make.
Oh, no. About it, but I was about the same age when I read Gone with the Wind, about 15 or 14, and I think my parents actually hid it somewhere or put it somewhere because it wasn't supposed to read it. And I just remembered, I nearly cried when I got to the end. I wanted it to go on forever and ever and ever. And I always had a soft spot for any men that looked a bit like Clark Gable.
Yes, I can understand that.
And I agree with that, Dorothy, is it? That I thought Ashley was a wimp in the film too.
Yes.
Really, I couldn't understand why Scarlett could love him so deeply. So
Yeah. But does she actually love him, or is she just in does she just have this idea of love because he's the one that got away and married Melanie?
yes,
I think she sort of resents the fact that he married somebody else, and so she fixates on him. But when she actually comes to think about who he is, when finally her eyes are opened and she realizes that Rhett's the right man for her after all, I think, she finally comes to her senses, but it takes a long time. But so many of us, I think, have wept over Gone with the Wind. And when I gave it to my daughter to read, I knew she was getting near the end of the book. And I went up to her room and she was sobbing. She was absolutely overcome with grief. And she said, "Mum, Melanie died." And I had to sort of sit there and hug her and help her to recover. And then we went and watched the movie together and she sobbed all over again. So again, I had to use another box of tissues for her. And then she said, "Mum, I don't think I can have anything more to do with Gone with the Wind again. It just makes me a basket case." So it was all too much for her.
Thank you very much.
It was wonderful.
Oh, thank you. Well, look, thank you so much, everyone, for joining me. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, Susanna. Thank you.
Pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.